The rain had been falling for 3 days when Silas Renner finally admitted to himself that the silence he'd built around his life was not the same thing as peace. He hated dogs. He hated the long-eared, sharp-eyed kind most of all, the working breeds that looked at a man like they already knew what he'd done and forgave him anyway. So when the storm rolled in off Georgian Bay and pinned itself over the cedar woods north of his place, Silas told himself the whining he heard under the wind was nothing he needed to answer. He was wrong about that, the way he'd been wrong about most things since the day they handed him a folded flag and a thank you he couldn't feel. Before this ends, 3 half-drowned puppies will teach an old soldier that the coldest house can still be warmed by something that crawls in out of the dark and refuses to leave. If you believe in second chances, in loyalty, and in the strange mercy of being found, stay until the end. And tell us in the comments which town you're watching from tonight. Silas Renner was 61 years old and lived alone in a board and batten house at the end of a gravel road that the township plow only remembered to clear when somebody complained. The house sat on 11 acres of cedar and granite, outside a town small enough that the gas station and the post office shared a parking lot. He'd bought it for the quiet. That was what he told the realtor, and it was even partly true. The rest of the truth was that he couldn't stand to be near people who wanted things from him, and people always wanted something, even if it was only the story of how he'd earned the limp in his left leg and the scar that pulled the corner of his eyebrow down when he frowned. He'd been a Navy diver, then more than a diver, the kind of work that didn't go on a resume. 23 years. He came home for good when his knee gave out, and the rest of him had gone quiet, in a way the doctors called adjustment, and he called nothing at all. His wife, Adele, had waited through every deployment, with a patience he never understood and never deserved. She used to say he loved like a man rationing water in a desert, doling out feeling in careful sips because some part of him was always certain the well would run dry. She'd been gone 4 years now. A stroke, fast and merciless, in the kitchen of this very house while he was out splitting wood and didn't hear her fall. He found her with the kettle still whistling. He never told anyone that part. He never told anyone much of anything. The dog he didn't talk about either was named Bruno, a Belgian Malinois, lean and black-masked, the partner he'd had on his last 2 tours. Bruno had gone into a flooded compartment after a man who'd already drowned, because that was what Silas asked of him, and Bruno had not come back out. Silas had gone in after the dog and dragged him to the surface and done everything a man can do, and it had not been enough. He'd carried Bruno's collar in his pocket for 11 years. He still couldn't look at a working dog without feeling the weight of that wet leather in his palm. So when the storm came that October and the cedars bent low and the rain turned the gravel road into a creek, Silas sat in his chair with a cold cup of coffee and the radio off, and he heard a sound he didn't want to hear. It came from beyond the woodshed, down toward the gully where runoff cut through the property in wet seasons. Thin, high. Not the wind, though he tried for a long minute to make it the wind. He knew distress the way other men knew their own names. His body was already standing before his mind had agreed to it, and he cursed under his breath, the old reflex of a man whose instincts had outlived their usefulness. He took the flashlight from the hook by the door, pulled on the canvas coat that still smelled of cedar smoke, and stepped out into the weather. The cold went through him like a memory. Rain stung sideways and the flashlight beam filled with falling water, and his bad knee complained with every step down the slope. He found them at the bottom of the gully, in the lee of a deadfall where the current hadn't quite reached. A dog lay there, a shepherd mix by the look of her, gold and gray and soaked to nothing, her body curled into a question mark around a torn feed sack. She wasn't moving. Silas crouched and put 2 fingers to her ribs the way he'd been trained to do on things that mattered, and felt no warmth there at all. She'd been dead some hours. Her body had still made a wall against the wind for as long as it could. Pressed into the curve of her belly were 3 puppies, maybe 5 weeks old, and 2 of them were too still. The third was not still. The third was screaming. She was the smallest, a scrap of wet gray fur with 1 ear that wouldn't stand, and a voice far too large for the body that held it. She climbed over her silent brother and her motionless sister, and she pushed her blunt little face toward the light, toward Silas, toward anything, and she howled at him with everything she had. It was not a pretty sound. It was the sound of a creature that had decided, against all available evidence, that someone was coming. Silas knelt in the freezing mud, and the rain ran off the brim of his cap. The flooded compartment, the leather collar, the weight of a thing he could not save. Not this, he thought. Not again. I haven't got it in me. He could leave them. Nature was indifferent, and he was no priest of it. The two still ones were likely already gone. The gray one would follow before morning. There would be nothing to grieve because he would not have let himself begin. He started to rise. The gray puppy lunged off her dead mother's body and fell into the mud at his boot and lay there, panting, her flank heaving, her whole self pressed against the leather of his boot as if it were the last warm thing in the world. She didn't cry anymore. She'd spent it all. She just leaned on him and shook. Something in Silas Renner that had been frozen solid for a long time cracked clean down the middle. "All right," he said, and his voice came out rough as gravel. "All right, stop. I've got you." He opened his coat and tucked the gray one against his chest, and she was so cold she felt wet through to her bones. Then he gathered the other two, the silent ones, and held all three against the warmth of his body. And he climbed back up the slope with his knees screaming and his breath ragged, and a dead dog behind him in the dark that he would come back for. Because you did not leave them, you never left them. That was the one law he had left. Inside, he laid all three on a towel by the wood stove and got the fire roaring and worked on them the way he'd worked on men. The black male was breathing, shallow but breathing. The brindle female was not. He rubbed her small chest in circles with 2 fingers, breathed warm air across her muzzle, willed the stubborn spark of her back from wherever it had drifted, and for a long while there was nothing. And then there was a cough, and a squeak, and a tiny outraged sound of life objecting to having been nearly lost. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He named them that night, though he told himself he wasn't keeping them. The black male watched everything with a still ancient gravity, the way a sentry watches a tree line, and Silas called him Deacon. The brindle female, the one he'd nearly lost, came back fighting and didn't stop fighting, gnawing his thumb with toothless gums an hour, after she should have been dead, and he called her Juniper, after the scrub that grew out of bare rock, and would not be discouraged. And the gray one, the one who'd crawled to his boot and refused to let him leave, he looked at for a long time before he said the only word that fit. "Wren," he said, small and gray and loud out of all proportion to her size. He stripped off his wet flannel and sat back in the chair, with Wren against his bare chest under the wool blanket, because warmth that came from a body did what no fire could, and he'd learned that in places he didn't talk about. She lay over his heart, cold as river stone, and he made himself breathe slow and steady, a bellows for the smallest fire in the world. The storm beat the windows. The house ticked and settled, and then, against his ribs, he felt it. A flutter. A fast, frantic heartbeat, finding his slow one and matching itself to the rhythm, the way a frightened thing borrows calm from a calmer thing. Adele came back to him then, not dying on the kitchen floor while the kettle screamed, but young, laughing, her hair coming loose, telling him he loved like a man afraid the well would run dry. He felt something hot slide down the side of his nose and was astonished to find it was a tear, the first in 4 years. He didn't wipe it away. He kept his hand flat on the puppy's back until the shaking eased and the small heart steadied, and for the first time since he'd buried his wife, the silence in the house did not feel like an accusation. "Don't get used to this," he told her. She was already asleep. Winter came down hard over the bay, and somewhere in the middle of it Silas Renner stopped pretending. The 3 of them grew the way puppies do, which is to say overnight and all at once, and by January his careful, ordered, ex-military house had been conquered, occupied, and reorganized by an army that stood 18 inches tall. Deacon, the black one, turned out to be a thinker. He didn't chew things like his sisters did. He studied them. He learned which cupboard held the kibble and worked the latch with his nose until it surrendered. He learned that if he sat very still by the door at 5 in the morning and stared, Silas would eventually feel the weight of being watched and get up. He learned the precise sound the truck made, turning onto the gravel, and would be at the window before Silas had the key out of the ignition. He was, Silas told the woman at the feed store, Less a dog than a small, quiet supervisor who'd been assigned to oversee an old man and had taken the job seriously. Juniper, the brindle, was chaos-given fur. She had nearly died and seemed determined to make up for it by living at maximum volume. She ate a slipper. She ate the corner of a kitchen chair. She got her head stuck in an empty coffee can and reversed around the kitchen in a panic until Silas, helpless with a laughter that frightened him because he'd forgotten the muscles for it, got down on the floor and freed her, and she licked his whole face in gratitude and then went immediately to eat the can. And Wren, the gray runt who'd crawled to his boot, grew into a lean gray shadow who stole things. Not destroyed them, stole them. She had a den under the back stairs, and into it she carried her treasures, one sock at a time, a dish towel, a glove, the TV remote, once an entire loaf of bread still in its bag, dragged backward across the floor with enormous dignity. Silas would find the den every few weeks and sit on the cold floor and pull his belongings out of it, one by one, and laugh until his eyes ran. And he never could decide whether he was laughing at her or at himself, the hard old man undone by a thief the size of a cat. He'd built a routine, of course. He couldn't help it. Feed at 6, out at 6:15. The plan survived about 4 days. Before Wren learned to open the pantry, and Juniper discovered the baseboards, and Deacon began rearranging Silas's boots into a neat row by the door every morning, which was somehow the most unsettling thing of all. He gave up the schedule and kept the dogs, and didn't examine too closely which one had surrendered to which. The neighbor who made him keep examining things was a woman named Florence Aubin, 74, who lived a half concession over and drove a rusted-out Subaru like she was being chased. She'd brought him a casserole the week after Adele died, 4 years back, and he'd taken it without a word and not invited her in, and she had simply kept coming anyway. On no schedule he could discern, with bread and soup and unsolicited opinions, refusing to be discouraged by his silence in much the way Juniper refused to be discouraged by a closed door. When she saw the 3 dogs that first winter, she'd looked at Silas for a long moment, and her eyes had gone bright and wet, and all she'd said was, "Well, about time something loud happened around here." Then she'd gotten down on her knees in her good coat to let Juniper chew her mittens. The trouble came on a gray afternoon in the thaw, when the snow was rotting off the rocks, and the gully ran high and brown with meltwater. Silas had taken a box down from the high shelf in the closet, the one he never opened, and in it, among the medals he never wore, was a small flat tin. And in the tin was Bruno's collar. 11 years of carrying it had worn the leather soft. He was sitting at the kitchen table with it in his hands, not crying, just gone somewhere far away, when Juniper came barreling in from the next room with something in her mouth, proud as anything, tail going like a flag in a gale. It took Silas a moment to understand what he was looking at. She had been into the box. She had Bruno's collar's mate, the spare, the one Silas hadn't known was still in there, and she had it clamped in her jaws with a tooth mark already bitten deep into the leather. He was not in the kitchen anymore. He was in black water with a dead dog in his arms and a failure so total it had its own gravity. And the sound that came out of him was not a word. "Drop it." His voice cracked like ice underfoot, and all 3 puppies froze. "Drop it, now." Juniper, who had never once in her short loud life been spoken to like that, opened her mouth, and the collar fell to the floor with a small soft sound that detonated something in his chest. He was up out of the chair. The past arrived not like a ghost but like a fist. "You don't touch that," he said, and the words came out shaking and cruel, aimed at the dog and missing, hitting only himself. "You don't get to. You're not. You're animals. You wreck things. You ruin everything you put your damn mouths on." Deacon's ears went flat. Wren pressed herself to the floor. Juniper's tail dropped between her legs, and she looked up at him with a confusion so total and so trusting that it should have stopped him, and it almost did, and almost was the worst word he knew. He opened the back door to the cold, wet dark, and he put them out. All 3. Juniper first, then Wren, who went trembling, and last Deacon, who paused at the threshold and looked back at Silas with those still amber eyes, not pleading, just witnessing, the way he'd watched everything since the night he'd been pulled half-dead from the gully. That look nearly broke him. He shut the door on it anyway because retreating into anger was the only retreat he had ever been any good at, and he stood with his back against the door and his fist around 11 years of worn leather, and he shook. He let them out, he told himself. Just the yard. The yard was fenced. They'd be cold and they'd learn, and he'd let them in by dark. By dark, the rain had turned to sleet and Silas's anger had burned down to ash and shame, and he opened the door to call them in and counted 2 shapes huddled miserable on the porch. Deacon. Wren. He counted again. He counted a 3rd time. The way you count when counting cannot change the answer. Wren was at the far corner of the porch with her one bad ear flat to her skull, and she was staring through the fence at the place where the rails had pulled loose from the post, at a gap a determined small dog could push through, and she was making a sound he'd never heard her make, low and frantic and lost. Juniper was gone. He went out into the sleet with the flashlight and the 2 dogs at his heels, and he found the gap and beyond it. Juniper's tracks pressed into the rotten snow, headed downhill, toward the gully, toward the brown roar of the meltwater. He called her name until his voice gave out. The wind took it and gave nothing back. "Find her," he said to Deacon, and he didn't know if a 6-month-old pup knew what the words meant. But Deacon's nose went to the ground and his whole body changed, became something older than his age, and he started down the slope with Wren beside him, and Silas fought his own dogs into the dark. They searched for 2 hours. His knee was a sheet of fire, and his hands bled from the brambles and the sleet had soaked through to his skin, and he did not slow down, because somewhere out ahead of him was a loud brindle puppy who'd nearly died once already in the cold and trusted him to never let it happen again, and he had put her out in it himself. The shame of that drove him harder than the fear. A light came bobbing down the trail behind him. Florence, in her dead husband's hunting coat, with a lantern in one hand and a coil of rope over her shoulder, moving fast despite the bad hip that gave her walk its careful tilt. "Saw your flashlight from the road," she said, breathing hard. "Figured you'd gone and gotten into something." She didn't ask what. She lifted the lantern and the trail jumped into gold. "Well, let's go get your girl." It was Deacon who found her. He stopped at the edge of the gully where the bank fell away to the swollen creek, and he went rigid, nose down, and let out a low, urgent whine that lifted the hair on Silas's neck. Wren surged past him to the lip of the bank and started to bark, high and broken, the same enormous voice that had crawled to his boot in October. Silas swept the flashlight down. Juniper was on a shelf of gravel in the middle of the channel, half in the water, and the brown current was rising over her hind quarters, and she was caught. The beam caught the dull glint of it. Rusted metal clamped around her back leg, an old leg-hold trap somebody had set and forgotten years ago. Illegal as sin, buried in the silt until the flood had washed it bare. She saw the light and she screamed, and it was the worst sound he had ever heard. Worse than the wind, worse than the kettle. He didn't think. He went down the bank on his backside, gravel and ice tearing at him, into water so cold it stopped his heart for a beat, and started it again with a slam. The current shoved at his thighs. He reached her and she licked frantically at his face and his hands, terrified, trusting, and he plunged his arms into the freezing water and found the trap, found the jaws, found the spring, and pushed. It didn't give. His fingers went numb. The water climbed her chest. Silas! Florence on the bank, bracing the lantern in a fork of the deadfall, paying out the rope. "Rope around you, you stubborn man, before that creek takes you both." Deacon caught the end of the rope in his teeth and dragged it down the bank, and Silas looped it round his waist, with hands he could barely feel. Wren came down off the bank and into the shallows beside him and planted herself against his hip, all 40 pounds of gray shadow leaning into him like a living brace, hating the water, hating the cold, doing it anyway. He set his frozen fingers to the trap spring again. "Deacon," he gasped, and pointed at the chain where it caught on a sunken root. "Pull." The black dog seized the chain in his jaws and threw his whole young body backward. Paws gouging the gravel and the chain came taut, and Silas drove the spring down against the cold and the current and his own failing strength, and Florence hauled the rope from above with her small body straining and her bad hip screaming, and Juniper cried once, and that one sound pulled something up out of the deepest locked room in Silas Renner that he'd thought was sealed for good. "Nobody gets left," he said through his teeth, to her, to Bruno, to all of them. "Not tonight. Not ever again." The jaws gave. An inch, then more, and her legs slid free and she collapsed against his chest, shaking so hard her teeth clicked together. Wren caught his sleeve and tugged him toward the bank. Deacon scrambled up first and turned and barked them on. Florence pulled and Silas climbed, and the 5 of them came up out of that ravine together into the sleet, an old soldier and an old woman and 3 half-grown dogs, none of them left behind. The snow came back the next winter, the way it always does up there, but the house at the end of the gravel road was not the same house. It smelled of wood smoke and wet dog, and the bread Florence still left on the porch, because she'd decided years ago that Silas couldn't be trusted to feed himself and saw no reason to revisit the verdict. Juniper's back leg healed with only a stiffness that ached in the cold, which meant she limped a little on the bad days, the same days Silas's knee bothered him, and the 2 of them would lie by the stove in shared dignified complaint. On the mantel, beside a framed photograph of a young man kneeling in the desert with a black-masked dog, beside a picture of a woman with her hair coming loose and laughing at something just off camera, Silas Renner set out 3 things he'd carried too long. Bruno's collar, the worn one, his own folded thank you in its triangle of glass, and a small flat tin, opened now, empty now, because there was nothing left in it that needed to be hidden. He stood there a long while in the early dark. He wasn't saying goodbye to Bruno or to Adele. He was saying goodbye to the years he'd spent believing he didn't deserve to be found. Then he went out to the porch. The snow came down soft and forgiving over the cedars and the granite and the gully, where the worst night of the year had nearly cost him everything. Deacon settled across his boots, a warm, grave weight. Wren leaned against his bad knee with a stolen mitten in her mouth that he decided not to fight her for. Juniper limped over and put her gray-flecked chin on his thigh, and sighed the enormous sigh of a creature who had decided the world was, on balance, all right. Silas looked out at the white quiet that had once felt like a tomb and felt now like a home, and he scratched the brindle ears under his hand, and he understood at last what Adele had been trying to tell him all those years. A miracle does not always come with thunder, or light, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes it crawls to you out of the cold on 3 small legs, screaming that someone is coming, and it turns out the someone it was screaming for was you all along. If anyone out there is carrying a grief no one else can see, if you've locked a room in your own heart and lost the key, this is the part where you're reminded that love still finds a way in through the cracks, oft on small muddy paws, often through the very thing you swore you'd never let yourself need again. If this story found you tonight, leave a word below and tell us where you're watching from, and tell us about the animal that once refused to let you go. And if you believe that no soul, human or otherwise, should ever be left out in the cold, stay with us, because there are more of these to tell.